What is up, Mentors Collective? Thanks you for joining me on another episode. If you're tuning into this one, you're in for a treat because you're listening to a podcast. I am obsessed with podcasting. Obviously, you are too. And it's not just a fun tool for learning, for education. It's also a great tool for networking, for marketing. And on this episode, I've got one of the pros when it comes to not only podcasting, but networking, marketing, building a software company. And we're going to dive into how my guest booked guests like Grant Cardone, Shaquille O'Neal on his own show, because that's something that I'm super intrigued by and I would like to learn. And I am very grateful to welcome my guest today. Travis is the founder of Guestio.com, the quality guest booking show where podcasters can list their shows, find guests, book guests. My show is actually on there as well, and I am on there as a guest. So not only having this conversation kind of to learn, I'm also kind of meeting the founder of a platform and a product that I actually use, which is really exciting. And his podcast, Build Your Network and Figuring It Out, is an awesome podcast where he interviews people like Shaquille O'Neal, Rob Dyrdek, and Grant Cardone. So excited to talk a little bit about that too. Travis Chappell, welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, dude? How's it going?
Going really well. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Obviously, you're a busy guy, interviewing people like Grant Cardone, running a very successful software company. Guestio, by the way, after using it, kind of my user experience, it's just been awesome. I've booked some really cool people on the show. Someone's booked me on their show. Really fun UI. If you guys are listening and haven't already checked it out, and you are a podcaster or a want to be guest on other podcasts, definitely kind of the industry leader in that space. So Travis, again, thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course, dude. Happy to be here. Happy to chat. Any and all things podcasting or marketing or whatever else you want to talk about.
Cool. Appreciate you lending your brain, getting some wisdom. That's what this show is all about here. I started this to talk to people like you, learn for growing my own network marketing, and just kind of dig deeper into the entrepreneurial mindset and community. So thank you for being here with me, and for my audience. I know we're going to get some value. And Travis, we spoke briefly pre-episode. You've been podcasting for 5 years. You've had some massive guests. Talk to me about what that journey was like over the 5 years. How did you get where you are today?
Yeah, long and slow. It was just a lot of consistency in the beginning, a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting without really getting much out of it. I was doing 3 interviews a week when I first started, and I didn't have a business yet. I was still doing door-to-door sales at the time and trying to figure out how I was going to make money online. Had at least enough foresight to understand that I knew I didn't want to be knocking doors much longer, and knew that I needed to pivot into doing something different that was going to set me up to live the type of life that I wanted to live. And so at that point, kind of made the decision to go into this podcasting world. I had no idea how I was going to make money. I had no idea what the business would turn into, or that it would lead me into freaking software. And it's just, no idea any of that stuff. It's just kind of like, I know I want to do a podcast because I like podcasts. I like consuming podcasts, and it seemed like a cool way to make some money. So let's do this. And the show started going well, probably after 18 months to 2 years. Enough to where people, entrepreneurial friends were kind of like, hey, can you help me start a show? I want to talk to people like that. How did you get this person on? Or how did you do this particular thing? And so I started doing podcast coaching and just kind of leaned into what people were asking me about, and started podcast coaching business, started coaching people, entrepreneurs specifically, about how to start a podcast. And then once my client load got full and there were still more people that were asking, we turned it into a course and a community and started teaching that to people. And so we had the, podcast coaching clients, and we had some done for you production clients, and we had some course students and community members, and everybody was experiencing the same problems, which was, I don't know how to book massive name guests on my show, and I don't know how to get booked on big shows to promote my own show. Can you guys help me do that? And that's kind of where Guestio came about. It was the software solution to the problems that we were experiencing, not only in our own podcast, but also with all the clients and customers and community members that we had. So that's kind of where Guestio came from.
Crazy. I definitely want to pull this in 2 separate directions right now, because you started a very successful software company without any experience in software, which I'm always super curious about. And we'll dive into that a little bit later. But where I want to start is kind of, I guess, what you got your roots in, which is helping people with their podcast, develop it, book great guests. So tell me, you said it was about 18 months in until your podcast really started to take off. What was your first big guest?
Yeah. And I wouldn't even say take off. It was just like to the point where it felt like it was actually like doing something. Because for a long time, it just felt like I was talking into a void, like a vacuum. Like it just felt like I was saying stuff, but nobody ever heard me. It just was crickets, but the first, it's difficult to say the first like big guest because it kind of depends on what you would define as big. Right. In my mind, the first person that I got on my show that was well known was John Lee Dumas, who was the person that got me into podcasting to begin with. He was I listened to his podcast all the time, and I took his free podcast course. That's kind of what made me want to start my own show. And so when I was first getting started, I paid to go to a mastermind at his house because I wanted to learn directly from him. And so I got him on my show just from building that relationship by going to his house with there's 4 or 5 other people that were going there. It was built a personal relationship with him, and then got him on my show, and then leveraged that into getting people like Patrick Bet-David and a couple others at the very beginning. But at the time, Patrick wasn't nowhere near as big as he is now. He had like 300,000 YouTube subscribers at the time.
Wow.
Now he has like 3 point something million. He's been on Rogan and like all this other crazy stuff. And he just sold his company for multi 9 figures. So he's doing like leagues better, exponentially better than he was doing when I first interviewed him. But we also interviewed him a second time, and at least people knew who he was, and he was booking people for his stages and his events and stuff like that at the time. So it lent a lot of credibility to my brand. And then probably the first big get that I remember thinking like, wow, I can't believe I just talked to him, was probably Grant. Just because he was another one of those people like John Lee Dumas, Gary Vee, Grant Cardone, Jordan Harbinger, Bigger Pockets, Lewis Howes. Like these were like Tim Ferriss. These were like the first shows I ever listened to. And so like anytime I marked off one of those like kind of legendary people that I listened to for a long time, it was always like, holy shit, I can't believe that, or holy crap, I can't believe that just happened. I don't know if I can cuss here.
Right. You can cuss here. Yeah, some of those like A-leaguers like Grant Cardone, Lewis Howes, Tim Ferriss, when I hear people booking them, like my friend Omar, the rock star, he runs a very successful show. He's had Tony Robbins, Ed Milet, and some of the stories.
Omar's the homie.
He's a homie. I'll be seeing him next weekend. Any of the time, I always ask him, like, how did you book this guy? How did you book this guy? And some of the stories are really elaborate. He would have driven 3 hours, camped out in front of their house, crazy shit. So Grant Cardone, for example, what's your story? How did you get him on your show?
Yeah, for that one in particular, it is a little bit more of a crazy story just because like nowadays, if I really want somebody, there's probably somebody that I know that can make an intro, or several somebodies I know that can make an intro. But back then when I was first starting, I didn't know anybody. And I interviewed Grant when I had less than 500 downloads an episode, and when I was less than a year into it for sure, but maybe a little bit over 6 months. So I'd tell people like I did not, when I interviewed him, I did not deserve to be there at the time. Right. And so that's really, that whole experience taught me one really big lesson, which is what I'll get into here. The first time I reached out to him to be on my show was before I launched. It was the summer that I was launching my show, and I wanted to interview Grant, and I reached out, sent him a DM on Instagram, and just never heard back. It was ignored. And frankly, I was expecting that to happen. I wasn't expecting me to reach out and get a yes right off the bat. But then when he ignored me, it was just kind of like, okay, well, that's kind of a bummer, but I'll figure it out. We'll figure out a different angle. And from that point forward, what I started to really realize was that people would say yes based on the credibility that was in the reach out message that I sent them, not based off of what I put on my website or anything else. Because anybody that's busy, you have to get them to say yes sooner rather than later, or they're going to lose interest really quickly. So I started focusing on like, how do I get people to say yes with just like the one reach out message that I sent them? And I started to realize that it had nothing to do with me. There's nothing that I could say about Travis Chappell that was going to impress them.
Right.
But the people that I had on my show up to that point, if they happened to know those people, they were way more likely to say yes to coming on the show without having to do a bunch of additional research or ask me about my download numbers or anything like that. Because I knew I'd lose them if I told them my download numbers.
Right.
So the the second time I reached out to Grant, it was about 6 months later. And in that time period, I had interviewed Brad Lee and Elena Cardone and Ed Milet and Lori Harder and Carrie Kasem, and like all these people that I knew were going to be speaking on his stage at 10X that year. So they're all people that I knew that he knew, liked, trusted, and had done business with. And so the second time when I reached out, I didn't really say anything about me. I didn't say much about my show except for that I had one. And then I was just like, hey, here's all the people that I've interviewed. And I think at the time it was like 12 names that I listed, including his own wife. And was just like, when are we going to be able to get you on the show? And then I told him, I was like, I'm going to be out in Miami next week. You know, maybe we can get something on the books. And then all he responded with was something like, come and see us, text my assistant, and we'll make it happen. And he sent me his assistant's number. And that was when I realized that like the metric for whether or not somebody decides to come on your show or give you the time of day isn't really your download numbers. It's a factor, but it's not the core metric. The core metric is this person going to waste my time?
Right. They
want to know, is this going to be a useful use of my time or a useless use of my time? And obviously, if you have a ton of downloads, it's not a waste of anybody's time, right? So like, that's what I mean by it's a factor, but it's not the real decider. The real decider is, are you going to waste my time? And, some people look at it as like, look, if you're just a good quality person that prepares and we're going to get good content out of it, then stop by. We'll do the interview. It's not that big of a deal. They're just sick of all the people who don't do all of that and then presume that that they're just going to be able to chat with them and then take it for granted. Don't prepare, ask shitty questions. You know what I mean? Like they've experienced too many people wasting their time. So they have to be on guard for their time, or they have to have a gatekeeper or multiple gatekeepers to be on guard for their time. And the difference between you being able to get in there and not being able to get in there is whether or not you can convince them that you're not going to be that person that wastes their time. And so I started to realize that like, because at the time I didn't have the download numbers, what I needed was the additional credibility, which came through getting really good guests on my show, which is why it just kind of turned into this kind of almost game for me of like, I didn't think these people were going to say yes, but they did. I wonder who else would say yes that I don't think would say yes, and just started asking people. And yeah, I got rejected and ignored more than I got accepted, but sooner or later that, it starts to shift. You know what I mean? And like the scale's this way, but then like over time that scale starts to like really tip the other way when you start like just keep on piling on the names. It's just like at this point within the entrepreneurial space anyway, there's not many people that I wouldn't be able to get a hold of and interview if I really, really wanted to get a hold of them and interview them. But it's only because we're coming up on 800 episodes and I've interviewed some of the biggest and best names in the entire space. Over a long period of time. So now we have a good amount of trust. We have a lot of credibility. We have way more authority. And we've interviewed, people like Shaq, which kind of separates us from the rest of the entrepreneurial podcasts that have only interviewed entrepreneurs. So yeah, it's just a constant game of just leveling up the people that you talk to, communicate with.
It is like a game. It's fun. I wonder, is there any single name on your list that you really want to take down and have on your show that you have been unable to get on the show yet?
Yeah, Gary Vee. Of all the people that I've interviewed, I've never interviewed Gary Vee. And I have tried a few times to get a hold of him. That's one that's just kind of always escaped me. But he's always been, he's just somebody that's always leveling up, So like I got into the game a little bit too late. There was a time when he would say yes to anybody that asked him to be on their show because he's that guy, right? He's the guy that spent freaking 5 hours a day on Twitter responding to people. And he was the guy that would say yes to every podcast interview for a while. But by the time I worked up the courage to send him something, he was no longer that guy. And then by the time my show picked up a ton of speed and traction, and we actually had great guests and stuff like that, he was like, he kept outgrowing my growth at every step, So even at this point, I haven't tried in a hot minute, but I would definitely still like to interview Gary because he was one of the first ones that I would ever listen to as well.
I feel like he's been recently starting to. Tim Ferriss would be huge.
Yeah,
Rogan would be huge. I mean, those are like, I guess they're not even A-list. They're like in the stars somewhere. But
yeah, I mean, like you got A-listers, but then you have like, I mean, it's like you know, you have somebody that's in the NBA, but then there's Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal and LeBron James and people, or Michael Jordan. You know what I mean? It's like
right.
There's professionals, and then there's like legends. You know what I mean? And yeah, Gary's an entrepreneurial legend for sure at this point. Got to be top 5 all entrepreneur influencers, you know, in the world.
Agree with you. Everybody knows that name. So, I don't know. Doesn't matter where you go, who you ask. Everybody knows who Gary Vee is. That's powerful.
Yeah. When the entrepreneur, like if you've been a micro influencer for a long time, and then all of a sudden, like you transcend your own space, like that's how you know, like that's Grant's been able to do that. Gary's been able to do that. You know, Tony Robbins been able to do that. There's a few people that have, but it's legends. Not common. Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that you brought up, that it's not about downloads, is something that I've noticed too. A lot of people don't realize a lot of these superstars, like the names we've been mentioning, need the content too. And that's what this is for them. It's an opportunity to create good content and answer good questions, ideally those that haven't been asked too many times before.
Yep.
How many times have you been asked for your download numbers? Has that been a make or break a lot of times? Because it has not been for me.
Yeah, maybe a dozen times.
Yeah.
Over 800 episodes of my show. You know, like there's definitely been some times where it hasn't gone anywhere because of that.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed too. They're there for the content. If you can provide them good content, a cool studio like you've got behind you. I don't know if you're watching the video clip here, but a good space for them and a good interview is all that they're really looking for in this case. They don't need more exposure.
For professionals.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they want all of that stuff that comes along with it. And most people, especially if they're in promo mode, they want any traffic.
Do they always show up with the full team, video, editors, video people?
It's like if you got 3,000 downloads an episode, you got 300,000 downloads an episode. Like, I don't care. I'm promoting this book and I want as many people to buy it as possible. So I'm going to go on every single one that I can, because if I get 4 book sales from it, it was worth my time. You know what I mean? Like those, like they're thinking in such macro terms in promo mode like that. So you will have better success or better chance of success at catching people when they're like trying to promote something heavily.
Yeah. When they're doing the podcast tour. Absolutely. All right, let's jump back a little bit to your early podcasting days. And I talk to a lot of podcasters. Everyone says the same thing. Your first year or two, you're kind of talking to a wall. Your audience is slim. Do you think a lot of that has to do with your skill as a podcaster, as an interviewer, and the value that you can provide as an entrepreneur? Or do you think it's just like the dues that you have to pay?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think a little bit of both. You know, I think that part of paying the dues are perfecting your skill set. You know, because when I started, I sucked at interviewing, and I didn't realize it was a skill set I needed to work on until I started. You know, the first like 35 interviews, 40 interviews that I did were just awkward as hell. And I wasn't fluid at all. I'd have weird transitions. I didn't know how to keep the conversation going. Like, it's a real skill to keep a conversation. Like, I love when people like say that critique about Joe Rogan. It's just like, he's an idiot talking to idiots. And it's like, come on now. Like, you can't, like, you can disagree with the guy all you want to, but like, the fact that he can sit there and have a 3-hour conversation with like a physicist, an entrepreneur, a comedian, and a psychologist or whatever, you know, like the fact that he can be the chameleon like that, carry the conversation, ask the questions, and be a host while he's smoking weed or drinking whiskey or doing whatever else he's doing, like, it's impressive and it's a skill set. And if you've never tried it, then you know, you're underestimating how difficult it is. And when I started, I sucked at it. And I think that's kind of just part of the game. You know what I mean? It's like if you did blow up during that time and you all of a sudden had 1 million listeners, like, I don't know how many you'd keep of them. You know what I mean? Because like, if you suck, you suck. And so like, even if you started off with 1 million listeners, it's like over the course of the year, how many are going to stick with you?
Right. There's a reason everyone listens to Rogan. I agree with you. He's a genius. Not only can he talk to the diverse group of people and know something about every subject, because he's sitting there for so many hours taking in all of this information, processing it, and it comes out on all these diverse interviews. And for 3 hours, the man is a machine. I also believe stand-up comedians are some of the smartest people on earth. So, you know, whatever political opinions you have on Joe Rogan, you can go ahead and have, but the man is smart. There's no doubting.
Yep. He's a clever dude for sure. But that's kind of my point is like, it's, you know, you're, I don't know if it's necessarily just the paying your dues thing. It's just kind of, you know, if you don't have any existing audience, it just takes a long time to build one. If it didn't, everybody would do it. You know what I mean? Like, of course, like if you get up to 100,000 downloads a month on your show, like without much effort, then a ton of people would be doing it. That's the reason that 90% of podcasts never make it past episode 7 or 8 or whatever that stat is. You know, there's over 4 million indexed podcasts now, I think, but there's less than 500,000 of those that are active. Less than 200,000 of them have released in the last week. There's like 150,000 shows of the 4 million in existence that have actually released an episode in the last 7 days.
Jesus, that's the human condition right there. We start things when we're not validated. We close them down. So
if you're not validated immediately,
right?
You know, it's like people will do that. I just remember having that thought when I was like 6 or 7 months in, just like, this sucks, you know, and it did suck because I was putting 25 hours a week into something that was paying me $0, and I wasn't used to doing that. I was a door-to-door salesman. I'm used to, if I put in 25 hours of work, I get a result from it, you know, and like I started doing this and I didn't get anything from it. And I was like, what am I doing? This is a massive waste of time. And it was very frustrating. But when I sat there and looked at it, I was like, you know what? People go to college for 4 years so that they can get out and get a job that pays them $72,000 a year.
Yeah, they're lucky sometimes.
Like if I want to be a podcaster, like I'm looking at these podcasters that are making 100,000 plus a month in sponsorship, you know, and it's like, I can't just sit here and expect to get that in 6 months.
Right.
People take 20 years of their career to get to 6 figures a year. And they'll never see 6 figures a month. And I'm sitting here like 6 months in whining about the fact that I have to work to go make this amazing life for myself. Like, like get some perspective, you know,
that's what it comes down to. Right. It's all about perspective. Like, if you go into that expecting that 6 months later, you're going to have, you know, the next Joe Rogan, you're going to be very disappointed and you're not going to make it. So when you went into this,
it's going to suck for a little bit. That's fine. Yeah. It's part of like, it's the barrier to entry. It's not something that you shouldn't be expecting is the thing is like people do it. And then when it happens, it's like, they're flabbergasted. Like, I can't believe this isn't taking off by now. It's like, bro, you've been putting out, like you have 43 episodes in 9 months. Like, talk to me when you have 2,050 episodes in 12 years. And if it's still sucking, then maybe you should do something different at that point. You know what I mean? But like, I doubt that it's good. Like if you do that much work over that period of time, something's going to work out. Something's going to hit. It might not even be the show itself. It might just be like somebody you connected with that offers you a job that pays you $250,000 a year. You know what I'm saying? Like something's going to hit if you put that much work into it over a long period of time. But these people, including me, that come in and are just like, I had to remind myself of that like once a month at the beginning, just like people put in 4 years at college to get a degree in liberal arts and then they go work at Subway. You know what I mean? Because they can't get a job. And it's like, if I'm trying to build this thing that pays me 6 figures a month in sponsorship revenue that allows me to travel the world, talk to my heroes and like live this super interesting life, like it's probably going to take more than 6 months to figure out. You know what I mean? Like maybe not for some people, but if you're planning on being the person that gets really lucky, then you may as well just go buy a lottery ticket.
Especially if you're in this category, right? Because that's important. There's a lot of people doing entrepreneurial business interviews. So to be in the top 10% of that, you really have to hustle hard, try and be unique. And talk to me about that. Is there anything else outside of good interviews, good content that you can do to assure that your channel keeps growing?
Yeah, spend money.
Talk to me about that. Where do you spend money? How do you spend money?
Yeah. If we're talking purely podcast related, like if you want to grow your podcast audience, the best way to grow your podcast audience is with other podcast audiences. Like buying Google ads, buying Facebook ads, Instagram ads, unless you have really deep pockets, is largely going to be a waste of money. The best way to get downloads on your show is to advertise on other shows and like anything in the podcast space. You can advertise on media players, podcast players, other podcasts, being a guest on other podcasts. Those are going to be the best ways to grow your podcast audience specifically.
I agree. If
So
you're
the
already
people that I
listening to
know-
podcasts, those are the easiest people to convert.
Yeah, right. Because they listen to podcasts at least.
Yeah.
If they're on, like, you got to think like there's only 400 million people that listen to podcasts, but there's 2 billion people using YouTube or Google or Facebook or Instagram. Like, you're already making a big guess that, like, you're already losing 80% of the people that you're putting the ad in front of because they don't even listen to podcasts. You have to teach them, like, people still don't know how to listen to a podcast.
Right.
Like 30-something-year-olds, not just 75-year-olds. They're like, wait, where do I find that? Do I have access to that? It's like, yeah, like, the app that's already preloaded into your phone called Podcasts. You click on that and then you search my podcast and now you're listening to it. Like, it's super simple. But if you've never listened, you've never consumed content on that medium before, like, you have to be taught those things. So if you're trying to get somebody to listen to your show and they don't listen to podcasts at all, you're having to do a lot more heavy lifting. Now, I will say that those people tend to listen to your show way longer than anybody else. Like, if you're somebody's first podcast, they'll stick with you for a long time because it's like just kind of this almost like relationship thing that they have with you. But it's way more expensive to acquire those listeners. Right. So the best way is to go get them on other podcasts. But that's like the real answer. Like, anybody listening that's like, I want to blow up my podcast. It's like, okay, as quickly as you know how, figure out how you can spend $100,000 a month in podcast ads. Start with $500, then $1,000, then $3,000, then $10,000, then $30,000. Like, that's the real answer that nobody really wants to know the answer to. Like, nobody wants to hear that answer, but that's the real answer. Because podcast discovery is the worst thing about podcasts is the lack of discoverability.
Right.
YouTube has great discoverability. TikTok has great discoverability. Instagram, Facebook, not as good as YouTube and TikTok, but still good. Podcast is horrible.
Is there a good place where you can pay, go through shows, see their demographics, their stats, and then pay to place an ad in that podcast? What is it?
Yeah, there's several. Red Circle, Megaphone, Anchor, Gumball, AdvertiseCast, Acast. There's a bunch of different platforms that you can, sponsor shows through.
Cool. And how do you track that, if at all? I mean, do you just look at your average downloads per episode after spending a certain amount of money and say that's what that did? Yeah,
and certain platforms will have at least some attribution where you can trace back traction to that specific ad so that you can continue to buy ads on the shows that are working well.
Okay, very cool. And talk to me a little bit about the software platform that you've developed, Guestio. Obviously, I'm on there from both ends. I think it's been really helpful for finding shows to get on and also booking awesome guests on my show. I found if you charge a little bit of money, you get much better guests, or at least interesting guests. Yeah, people who have accomplished something, they're willing to pay. And typically we have an interesting business conversation at the end of it too. So it's kind of a double benefit. Yeah. So my guess is there's two types of people listening right now. There's people who have their own podcast. If you don't already, you might be thinking about doing it. Highly recommend starting your own podcast, even if it's just to ask people like me and Travis onto your show and establish that relationship. And it's a great excuse to do that. Or you're an entrepreneur and maybe thinking about being a podcast guest. Either way, it's definitely important to know about these tools that are out there. So talk to me a little bit about Guestio. What do you guys do?
Yeah, that's essentially the problem that we solve in the market is like we want to connect hosts and guests. So if you do not have a show, but you know that podcasts can be a great tool. And by the way, if you're listening to this episode right now and you're like, I'm going to go check out Travis's stuff, it's a perfect example of why it's important to get booked on other shows. Because when you get booked on somebody else's show, even if that audience, like I said, has 500 people, like 500 downloads an episode, it's not a massive show. It's like, even if you get booked with that audience and 30 people listen to the whole episode all the way through and like you enough to come check out your stuff, that's 30 people that would have taken 4 months of relationship building on other platforms to get to the same point of know, like, and trust that they're at now because they listened to you for 45 minutes on a podcast episode. Right. The type of relationship building that you do with prospects on a podcast episode is unmatched just purely because of the sheer length of the time that you have people's attention. If you're going to follow me on Instagram, it's going to take you, 3 months to get the same amount of time with me than if you just listen to one of my podcast episodes. So being a guest on other people's podcasts is a fantastic way to market your show. It gives you gives you better SEO, more backlinks. Like if you Google Travis Chappell now, there's 13 pages of Google that are search results of me being interviewed on other shows, which is like a ton of content that just lives in the background on the internet at any time for people to like listen in and hear anything about my story that they want to hear. Whereas before I started, you had to get to like, just to find my website, you had to go to like page 3, of Google, which nobody does. You know what I mean? So it's great for SEO, great for backlinks, great for credibility, authority, content. It's good for all that stuff. And so if you are a guest that wants to get interviewed on shows, you can go to Guestio and you can search the show marketplace and pitch and book shows. If you are a show and you want to pitch and interview guests that are going to move the credibility needle for you, then you can go to Guestio and you can book and pitch those guests. So it's basically built to be a credibility and growth platform for people interested in growing through the podcasting space, whether they have a show or they want to be interviewed on shows.
Now, I see one question that's probably going to come up from the listeners here, and that's, is it worth it to pay to be a guest on somebody else's show, a big show? What are some of the benefits there? And do you see any return in doing so?
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's just like any other form of advertising. Like what's the benefit of putting an advertisement on a billboard?
Right.
It's the same thing. It's just, yeah. I mean, and it's going to be very similar. Like it's a good, I would say podcast guesting is more impactful than a billboard, just because a billboard to me would be more like podcast advertising. It's like 30-second mid-roll ad spot. It's really helpful and will bring awareness. But if you're interviewed for 30, 45 minutes and the people actually make it, like if you're still listening to this episode, then you're at least like, hey, this Travis guy isn't obnoxious. You know what I mean? Like you've made it this far in the episode. You're like, actually, like this guy's got a good point. I like his story, or I like something about him, and I'm going to go check out some of the other things that he has available. And if you make it all the way to that point, like that's a good scenario for me, because that means that we're at least like cut from the same cloth in some aspect. Like, because somebody else that's listening to this may have already like turned this off and started listening to a different episode because they didn't like me. And that's fine. Both of those people are going to exist. But if you get to know somebody for 45 minutes, you're probably going to have a good idea whether or not you do like them or you don't like them. And you can do business with them further if you want to do business with them further at that point. So to me, it's just like it's like any other form of advertising. It's like, are you wanting to get booked in Forbes? Of course. You wanting to get booked in TechCrunch and Entrepreneur? Like, yeah, of course you want to do those things. So why don't you want to go get booked on podcasts? It's the same thing, except for podcasts bring traffic and publications don't. So to me, it's like a mixture between PR and advertising. So if you have the budget and you were thinking about paying a podcast booking agency $5,000 to go get you booked on, 8 shows, your $5,000 might be better spent in the Guestio marketplace paying show hosts directly, because you're going to get more appearances out of it. First of all, but second of all, the podcast host loves you even more because they're not used to people giving them money for the audience that they've built. Everybody wants their audience and doesn't want to pay them any money. So if you're one of the people that's like, hey, I respect that you've taken the time and energy to build this audience, and I do have something to sell to them, I'm coming out with this book or this product launch or this SaaS tool or, whatever it is, you name it. And I want you to share my story with your audience for the purpose of driving results in this campaign that I'm running. Like, and like, I have money to spend with you. The result that you're going to get from that is way better than even some of the free ones that you do, because a lot of these podcasters are just like grateful. It's like, wow, really? Like you respect what I've built enough to pay me. Like, and we're not even talking about a lot of money here. A lot of like shows in Guestio are listed at $10, $25, $50. You know what I mean? And if you pay an agency to get you booked on that same show, by the way, the agency's going to charge you $500 for a show that you can find on Guestio for $30, just because you're going directly to the show. So there's a lot of reasons to pay for the appearances. You don't have to pay for all of them. Like people kind of assume I'm just the pay to play guy. Like, I've only paid for 1 or 2 podcasts ever. The other 300 plus I've been on have all been free. I'm not somebody that's like only pay to play, but if it can help you and it helps them and it's a win-win-win for everybody involved, like why not contribute to their pocket rather than the pocket of the firm that's making the connection email? You know what I mean?
I'm with you. And you also get the added benefit of the content that you create during the show. and the relationship that you build with the host. Podcast hosts are typically, very successful people. You have a software company, you have a fairly large agency. To spend as much time with each other as we're spending right now, you'd have to spend a couple grand to come to one of our masterminds or something like that. Whereas you can go on Guestio, pay $500 and come spend an hour with me on my podcast, building a relationship. And typically those people are also very successful people. So I'm excited to sit down and talk to them. And it's just it's a beautiful thing. So it's a wonderful thing for entrepreneurs to meet other entrepreneurs, get content, get exposure.
It's the best rapport building that there is.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Travis, let's end with some final tips you have for people who are thinking about starting their own podcast. What should they keep in mind perspective-wise? And if there's any tactics that you can give them, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, first thing I would say is just commit. If you don't commit from the beginning, your will to win will be for sale and it will not be that much to buy it. Meaning that like it's a long and arduous process to build a top rated podcast with actual listeners and value in the market. So if that's your goal, just know that it's going to take a long time. I think it's a worthy pursuit though. That was kind of the reason that I stuck in it for so long. Is like, I gave myself 2 years for the beginning. I was like 2 years, 3 episodes a week, and then I'll adjust afterwards as necessary. But I was like 2 years. And then it started, going a lot better. Month 18, month 20, month 24, so it kind of kept it going. But if it had like zero progress and I didn't interview anybody cool and it had no downloads and was making no money and didn't do anything, I would have let it go at that point. Sometimes you got to be like what Kevin O'Leary says, of take an idea behind the barn and shoot it. But I would say that if you are getting ready to start a podcast, commit to the long term, and be consistent. I know it's such boring advice, but it's just so true. Like we were just talking about. Well, there's less than 200,000 shows that have released an episode in the last week out of 4 million in existence. It's like, I mean, what is that? 2% or something like that of shows, right? 10% of 4 million would be 400,000, and then 25% of that would be 100,000. So, yeah, I mean, a couple percent of podcasts have released in the last week. Like, be consistent and commit to long term. And if you look back in 5 years from now, I think that you'll be really happy with the time that you spent, making that thing happen. And lastly, and most practically, if you treat your podcast like a hobby, it'll pay you like a hobby. If you treat it like a business, it'll pay you like a business. So treat it like a business if you want that. Because I tell people, like, you don't have to treat it like a business if you're cool with it being a hobby, but don't treat it like a hobby and then get upset when it doesn't pay you like a business. That's when I have a problem with it. When people are just treating it like it's a hobby and then being like, why am I not a millionaire yet? Or why am I not making 6 figures yet? Why don't I have any sponsors? Why don't I have any downloads? My show's not growing. It's like, well, how much have you invested in your show? Nothing. It's like, okay, well, I have a suspicion as to why it's not growing. You know what I mean? So, if you really want it to grow and you really want it to be like well-known, you cannot be afraid to spend money or invest money to grow the show, just like you would in any business. The cool thing is that this type of business has unlimited earning potential and will afford you the ability to talk to people that you never thought would give you the time of day. It'll give you a lifestyle, allows you to travel and hang out with people that you enjoy and learn things and make a lot more. Like, you can invest $1 million in a McDonald's franchise tomorrow and start and open your own business. And then like your max net profit that you can make on that one location that you paid $1 million for is like, what, 100 grand a year, something like that. Maybe in a good location, 150. It's like you paid $1 million to get in that project. It's like limited in how much money you can make in earning potential. It's limited in terms of where you can live. If you want to like manage it, you could also, I guess, hire a manager, but that cuts into your net profit. And then you have insurance, you have a bunch of employees, you have risk, you have overhead, you have leasing space and like all this other stuff, all for a max profit of 150 grand a year. So you start a podcast, if you put 1/15 of the amount of money that you put into that McDonald's into your podcast, it could grow into like a decent income for yourself, enough to where you can leave your 9 to 5 and like do podcasting full time within, 2-3 years. It's just that like most people won't risk the money. So like those would be the things that I would say, like commit to the long term, be extremely consistent, whatever your cadence is, stick to it. Once a week, do once a week and don't miss any. 3 times a week, do 3 times a week, and don't miss any. Whatever it is, stick to your cadence. And lastly,
Great.
if you really want to blow up a show, do not ever be afraid to invest money into it, because it'll pay you the way that you tell it to pay you.
Just great advice all around. And I hate to ask one more, but turning around from the other perspective, for those listening that might want to do more podcast appearances as a guest, what are some things that they can think about to get booked on top quality podcasts for free? Obviously, you can pay for it.
Yeah. Besides using Guestio or paying for it, the best way to get interviewed on shows is to build relationships with hosts. Have a reason for hosts to book you other than the expertise that you have to offer. So that also comes into audience, which is why, for anybody that gets booked on a ton of podcasts, they usually have their own podcasts. I don't know if you've noticed that, but that is typically how it goes, because they have something to exchange for the value. It's like if somebody has a podcast that gets 100,000 downloads an episode and you're trying to get on that show, like you and 500 other people are also trying to get on that show. So like being a 7-figure entrepreneur or 8-figure entrepreneur isn't a big deal at that point. When there's 500 people reaching out, there's 50 other people that are just as or more successful monetarily or in that particular space or industry, if it's not in the business space, just as much as you are. So what's the unique angle that you have? And a lot of times now it's like, oh, you have an audience that you can help grow my audience with. And that one thing is going to be the difference maker between. That's why I've gotten booked on shows that are frankly like out of my league, in my opinion. But they book me because of the people that I know and because I have something to reciprocate in value in terms of like swaps or sharing audiences or something like that, if that makes sense. So you have to think about it from their perspective as like, what brings value to the host? And if you're only thinking like, well, it's just because I'm just that good. No, you're not. I hate to break it to you. Like, you're just not. There's very few people that are just that good. You have to bring something else to the table. Like I said, you might even be that good, but when there's 12 other people that are that good and you're all going for one spot, being that good isn't good enough. You know what I'm saying? There's got to be something else. So what's the external or additional or unique value that you bring to the table? Is there something else in your story that you're leaving off the table? Like, do you also, are you an Ironman triathlete, and you'd never talk about that because you're talking to business shows. It's like, is there something that's unique like that you can throw into your story that makes somebody go, oh, that's more interesting. Like, cause they all look the same anymore, man. It's like, every person was featured in Forbes. They have a TEDx talk and they have an Amazon bestseller.
Right.
Every person, you know what I mean?
Every
it's not a
pitch that I
unique
get
thing
now.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not unique to do any of those things or have any of those things on your resume. Everybody has those. So it's like, if you have 12 of those, looking at coming on your show, it's like, well, which one are you going to be more likely to say yes to? Probably the person that already has a massive audience and is willing to share your content to their audience to grow your show for you, or somebody who's done something more interesting and unique as in addition to some of those other things that they've done. Like they run Ironmans or they run ultras or they, have traveled to 150 countries or, you know what I mean? Like what is the additional unique thing that you've done that's going to give you the edge on the other, dozens or hundreds of people that are trying to get interviewed on that show?
Right. Just to reinforce that success is not enough. I mean, you're a podcast host. You probably get emails from bookers all the time. Everybody's a 7, 8, even 9-figure entrepreneur. The only thing that'll get them booked on my show with success is billionaires can come on. I'll interview any billionaire that emails me. But you're right. It's audience. It's all about what is their social following. Do they have a podcast as well? Or want to do an exchange or something like that? So great advice for future guests out there. What can you offer that host? And if you already know that host or know somebody who knows that host, an intro goes a long way.
Yes, absolutely.
Travis, I want to thank you for coming on the show. This was a blast. Glad to meet you face to face. Been using your platform. It's been a lot of fun. So if you're listening to this, definitely go check out guestio.com. But Travis, where else can people find you? I know you're active all across social media. Yeah,
just go to travischappell.com, CHAPPELL, travischappell.com. Just because it's kind of a hub, it's where you can find whatever social links you like to follow the most. I'm probably most active on Instagram. at Travis Chappell. But yeah, travischappell.com is kind of like, you can go there and get directed wherever you want to go from there.
Thank you, brother. And listeners, go start a podcast. Go start applying as a guest. You've got this. See you in the next episode.